All right, just loading that up. We're at the mercy of the speed of the internet, whatever that might be. Every day it's a little different. There we go. That over there. All right, that is all in place, and we will start in just a second. Get page centered where it's easiest to begin.
Before we begin, can I ask you about Ephrath?
Sure.
If Ephrath is the name of Caleb's mother, in Chronicles, the Bethlehem of Ephrath versus Bethel, there's two Bethlehems in Judges, etc. Bethlehem, I think of the Simeonites, and then Bethlehem of Ephrath. Bethlehem of Ephrath being in Judah, and
right.
The commentary Ruth says Ephrath was Caleb's mother.
I'm trying to remember the name, but yes, that sounds right.
So I'm curious why we already know the name Ephrath here at this section in Genesis. If it's, or is this a writing that's looking at it from, say, the end of the exile after the lands have been assigned?
So there are a number of different parts of the Torah where we get that sort of wrinkle. Because, I mean, as we're going to see, we're going to recognize that this place, Ephrath, is now called Bethlehem. And the question is, when is the now? When we see in verse 19 that it gives this idea that it's called Bethlehem, or that seems unusual, because who are we telling? Are we telling the people who were alive during this time of Jacob's life? Or are we telling the recipients of the Torah at Mount Sinai, none of whom had actually lived in the land of Israel? Or are we telling a later generation? And this is something that most commentators come down on the side that it was intended to provide what's the right phrase? A spectrum of accessibility for the people who were at Mount Sinai, who would know some of these places by different names, depending upon their ancestral recollection of the time of being in Canaan during Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it would also be preloaded with information that would be known to the people who settled the land under the time of Joshua and through Judges and onward. So there are what might be viewed as anachronisms, but they're only anachronistic if you believe that the Torah was meant to be understood by only one group of people at one fixed point in the timeline. But with the Torah trying to speak to a spectrum of people, then we can understand some of the referencing forward and backwards in time to give it that broader audience.
So kind of like with Kiryat Arba and Hebron.
Exactly.
Got it.
Exactly. And that is as they say, that's a feature, not a bug.
Right.
All right. I think we've given a reasonable little cushion. So let's go ahead and set out in Bereshit 35, Genesis 35, and we're going to pick up with verse 16. So this is the next stage of Jacob's life. He has already confronted and dealt with his brother Esau, and now he is moving forward from Beit El, as was just discussed in the previous few verses. But there is another crisis. They set out from Bethel, but when they were still some distance short of Ephrath, Rachel was in childbirth, and she had hard labor. So we've heard of hard pregnancies before, but this is the first time we've heard of somebody really struggling with the actual birth that is about to take place. Now, remember, Rachel was the favorite wife. She was the one that Jacob fell in love with at first sight when he came to the well. She was the one that he worked for 7 years without hesitation in order that she could become his wife. And then there was the whole cheating with Leah, taking her place at the wedding. And then even though he got to marry Rachel, he then had to work 7 years to pay off that additional debt, which was really a pretty terrible way for an employer to treat their employee. Lavan was setting a very bad example for employer-employee relationships. However, Rachel has had difficulty with child bearing. She was unable to bear children until circumstances intervened, which we've talked about in previous classes, which allowed her to give birth to Joseph. And now she has just been able to conceive again, and she is going to give birth to the person that we will know as Benjamin. But of course, that is what's about to come. And with her going into a difficult labor, we know that something unusual is about to happen. When her labor was at its hardest, the midwife said to her, "Have no fear, for it is another boy for you." But as she breathed her last, for she was dying, she named him Ben-Oni, but his father named him Benjamin. Now, let's see if these little footnotes actually help with us. Oh, good. Right. So Ben-Oni would be the son of my strength or my suffering. Suffering is the more common translation of the Ben-Oni. And then Benjamin is the son of my right hand, which is more of an idea of strength. The right hand always being a metaphor for strength, or the place where you would rely for strength. And that would be what Jacob was trying to give him as a call. Now, there should be a couple of questions that automatically suggest themselves when reading these two verses. One is, why was the midwife telling her, "Have no fear, for it is another boy for you"? What was this? What fear was this allaying? And why would the phrase, "it's another boy," allay any fear? Additionally, why would the name that she gave to the child be removed or replaced by the name of the father? That seems to be a rather unusual behavior. Usually when somebody is named in Torah, they keep that name unless God changes it. Here we see it a little bit different. And up till this point, all of the children have been named by their mothers. And this is the first time we see Jacob exerting his own opinion into that process and changing the name to Benjamin. So that is something we're going to have to wrestle with. But let's make sure that we understand that indeed, thus Rachel died. This is where she passed away. And she was buried on the road to Ephrat, now Bethlehem. So we might have been expecting, with the death of this matriarch, that something else would be in store for her. So far, we have seen Abraham and Sarah both be buried in Hebron, in the cave of Machpelah, in the cave that Abraham secured for Sarah. We have seen Isaac, and we know that Rivka as well is buried there. We will eventually see that Jacob and Leah get buried there. It's a little unusual that Rachel is being buried here. It's not as though Hebron is like in another country. If they were still all the way back up in Haran with Lavan and all of that, okay, maybe they might want to bury her up there. But it's not more than a little ways from Bethlehem to Hebron to be able to bury her with the rest of the family. And so the location of her grave here outside of the family crypt is a little unusual. And that's something, of course, that we're going to have to wrestle with. However, it's not just that he digs a hole, but in verse 20, we see over her grave, Jacob set up a pillar. It is the pillar at Rachel's grave to this day. So we were having a little conversation when we first began with this concept of who was the audience of the Torah. Because after all, if we say ad hayom, until this day, are we saying until this day when this story was first being shared among the Israelites, which would be during the days of Jacob's immediate descendants? Are we saying ad hayom, meaning until this day, for the day at Mount Sinai, Shavuot, when the Torah was given? Are we saying ad hayom to the end of Moses's tenure, when he is at the edge of the land, and saying it's still there, you guys are going to get to go see it? Or is this ad hayom meaning some other later time, during the time of the judges, or during the time of the kings, or during our time as well? Well, we do have a traditional location for Rachel's grave. It is a place that is on the map. It's a little tricky at the moment, but because of politics, but it is there. So it's a little hard to say. I think the easiest answer, which may be also less satisfying, is, as I mentioned before, is that the Torah is not trying to speak to only one audience, but is trying to speak to as many audiences as possible. And in particular, as we'll see, the continuation of Rachel's grave as a marker is going to be something that has special importance in our interpretation of her life. So let us just say that this is speaking to us as well as speaking to the earlier generations. All right, now with that, Israel journeyed on. Israel, of course, being the new name for Jacob, and pitched his tent beyond Migdal Eder, and he continues to move to the next place. We don't get any additional elaboration. We don't get any additional information about what happens. What we do see, and this will not be our focus, but I always want to make sure that we understand that a little bit, is in verse 22. While Israel stayed in that land, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel found out. Now, there is a couple of things that happen that are very unusual in this verse. So we have the idea that he went in and that he is with Bilhah. And the question is, what was he thinking, and why was it going on, and what are we to make of this? Answering the last question first, what we are to make of this is confusion. And we get a very interesting grammatical and formatting clue that this is meant to be both a surprise as well as an incomplete telling. Because if you look over here on the Hebrew side, you'll notice that it says, and Israel found out, right? Israel heard, literally, what had happened. And then we get a marker that indicates that in the Torah, this is written with an open ending to that line, which is very, very, very unusual, because this sentence is not finished. We are in the middle of a sentence. That's why there's an etnachta. And it's very unusual to then go to a new line. This would be the equivalent of hitting a carriage return while typing in English, but having not put a period or any other bit of grammar that would signify the end of a sentence before hitting that carriage return. It's something that the English translation just can't quite catch. Really, if they were going to try and make it close, there should be an ellipse, a series of 3 dots to mimic what the Hebrew is trying to tell us. It's like, and Israel found out, and we don't get more than that. Now, what this probably has to do with, and indeed there is more discussion within the Midrash, is the idea that Reuben was unhappy that when Rachel died, that Leah did not move up to the preferred wife position, but that instead Bilhah, the handmaiden of Rachel, moved up to that position. And Reuben, according to the Midrash, didn't actually have sex with the concubine, which would have been a grave act of adultery, but instead was merely rearranging the sleeping couches, the sleeping patterns among his father and his wives. And that was the problem, because you're not supposed to interfere, obviously, as a child. Well, I mean, he is a grown man, but still the child of his parents. And this was done to defend his mother Leah's honor and her position within the family, as a criticism of his father Jacob, and as an ongoing complaint against the special treatment that Rachel, and by extension Bilhah, is receiving from Jacob. We're not going to go into it more than that today. I just wanted to make sure that we got a little bit of an explanation of that before we dive back into Rachel, because it reminds us that Rachel seems to be a very special person for Jacob, and by extension, Rachel is a very special person for the people of Israel. But unfortunately, we don't hear much about her, except for the fact that she was very pretty, that she didn't have kids very easily. She got some mandrake and then had some kids, and she had Benjamin and she had Joseph. That doesn't seem to tell us much about her. And this episode here with her death at the end is one of the longer narratives containing describing her life. And even this, as I suggested, seems to leave many questions unanswered. So let's take a look at our tradition and see how they have tried to answer them. But before that, as always, are there any questions before we leave the text? All right, not seeing anything on YouTube chat or on Zoom. So let's go ahead and dive in. So the first question we have to ask is, why is the midwife telling her it's a boy, don't be afraid? Why is this at all a reasonable sentence? It sounds like a complete non sequitur. Well, Sforno brings first a tradition that might help us understand the ancients' perspective on this. Do not be afraid that the infant about to be born will be a girl, although your pains are so great that there is reason for suspecting this. Now, that still probably sounds a little weird. Why would I think, based on how hard or difficult the pregnancy or the birth is, that the gender might be a girl? Remember, no ultrasounds back then. Well, the Talmud claims that the birth pangs associated with the birth of female children are greater than those associated with the birth of male children. Sforno is bringing a short version of this longer section of the Talmud, which is saying, I'm sorry, that's going to get very annoying. Let me just tell my phone to stop bothering me. Come on. Okay. Why it might be that with those birth pains, she was thinking it would be a girl, and why, if she was comforted by saying it was a boy, she would imagine the birth pains wouldn't be any worse. Well, this is what the Talmud has to say on this topic. What is different about the labor pains experienced by a woman who gives birth to a female? That they are greater than those experienced by a woman who gives birth to a male. Right? So the Talmud believes this is just a well-known, established, common, conventional wisdom among everybody who knows about pregnancy. That if you're having a girl during the delivery, it's harder than the delivery of a boy. Well, this one, a male, emerges in the manner in which it engages in intercourse, which is to say that he is face down. And that one, a female, emerges in the manner in which it engages in intercourse, which is to say face up. And they are essentially using the metaphor of the missionary position to explain different orientations at birth. And the idea is a female fetus turns its face around before it is born. But this one, a male fetus, does not turn its face around before it's born. The idea in the ancient world was that the girl would have an additional turning that was necessary for her to be born in the usual position that was not found when the boy was being born. And that additional turning would make the birth of a girl harder than the birth of a boy. Now, it may surprise you to learn that this is not medically true, meaning that there is not a rule that says boys are always born face down and girls are always born face up. It simply is that there is no correlation, let alone causation, with regards to the gender and the orientation of birth. It is true that there is a period of rearrangement where the fetus will reorient itself prior to birth, and that rearrangement can sometimes be very painful, and that rearrangement can sometimes go wrong, causing a breech birth or more difficulties in the actual delivery. However, it is not connected to to the gender of the baby itself, but instead is just one of those medical problems that can occur in different deliveries. So we should understand this less for its medical insights, which are missing, but instead understand this as being their attempt to understand the verse, which is so confusing, which is, if it's a girl, it's going to be harder than if it's a boy. I know it's hard, so you think it's a girl, but trust me, this one's a boy. It's okay. Now, why would the boyness then still be comforting if it wasn't really about the orientation of birth, because that really wasn't going to change the difficulty of the delivery? Then why are we to what are we to understand about the midwife's reassurance of the boy? Well, Chizkuni, I think, gives us a clear answer. For this child will also be a son for you, our line from the text. She meant that Rachel's prayer at the time when she gave birth to Joseph, that she would be granted to give birth to another son, had been fulfilled. So if you go back to Genesis 30:24, you will see that, and you know what, let's go ahead and I'll just show you how that works in Sefaria. We're going to just duplicate that. And we're going to go to Genesis, if I can spell, 30:24. And it went to 30, but not 24. So we'll have to do a little scrolling, get through all the names of all the kids, because Joseph's the last in the cycle here. Right? And so you can see here in verse 24 of chapter 30, she is saying, so she named him Joseph, which is to say, may the Lord add, may the Yosef, right, may he increase another son for me. So it explains that when she named Joseph, she was already anticipating and hoping for another child, another Ben. And indeed, this is the Ben that she was hoping for when we get to Benjamin. So according to Chizkuni, she was being reassured that indeed she was finally getting the child, the Ben, that she had been asking for from the moment she gave birth to her first child, to Yosef, whose very name hinted at this prayer. And so the midwife encouraged Rachel with her words, suggesting that it was not God's intention to let her die at this time, meaning that you're going to make it, you're going to have a child, because this one is going to be a boy, I'm sure, and God has heard your prayer. You will succeed in having this other son the way that you asked for. So the midwife's words then make a lot more sense, that she was trying to reassure Rachel that, yes, the pregnancy, the delivery is very hard, but this is going to be a boy, and that means that it will be fulfilling your original prayer. And I'm sure, kind of incorrectly, but this was what the midwife believed, I'm sure God's not going to let you die. Or perhaps we can say that the midwife was suggesting you will not die before the child is born. The child will be born and come out healthy and okay, even if your pregnancy and delivery are so hard, because God is going to fulfill the prayer that you gave. All right, does that seem to make a little bit more sense out of our original words of support from the midwife, who up till this point did not seem to have the world's best bedside manner? All right, now Or HaChaim wants to give us a little bit more information about all of this, because it's actually still a little unclear why the verse was worded the way it was. So what exactly was Rachel's fear, which the midwife tried to alleviate? That's our driving question, and he restates it for us. Well, assuming that Rachel was afraid to die, right, which would be understandable, how did the midwife's words relieve Rachel's fears by saying, this one too is a son for you? Right? This is not exactly the most helpful of phrases, because really, is that going to make the delivery easier? We had one possible suggestion, but as you can see here, both Chizkuni and Or HaChaim are not exactly expounding upon the idea that the gender changes the difficulty of delivery. In order to understand this, we must refer to Bereshit Rabbah 82:8, which is one of the great Midrash collections, that whereas a twin sister was born with all the other sons of Jacob, Benjamin's birth was accompanied by the birth of two twin sisters, triplets. This is why the midwife told Rachel that she should not be afraid to die, but that her special difficulties were due to her giving birth to triplets, something that had not been the case when she gave birth to Joseph. So this birth was harder because she has given birth to two girls so far, but there was also a son to come, and that's why it's hard. And the son that comes will be the last of the babies that you are giving birth to right now. So don't give up. I know that you gave birth to twins before, and that seemed hard. And I know you're probably not eager to have yet another delivery, having already given birth to two twin sisters. But the next one coming is going to be a boy, and that'll be it. So hang in there, Rachel. We're almost there. It's 33% harder than with Joseph, but we're almost there. All right, which is, I think, a very fair and reasonable interpretation if you accept that there were twin sisters with all the other boys. Because you're probably all wondering, where does the Midrash get the idea that Reuben had a twin sister and Shimon had a twin sister and Levi had a twin sister? Why? I mean, we hear about Dinah, but where were all these twins? All right, so we are going to take a look at the Midrash itself to try and figure this out. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nehemiah differed, meaning they interpreted this issue a little bit differently. The one said the tribal patriarchs married their sisters, meaning Reuben married his twin sister. All right, let that sink in. Let's see his proof. Since it is stated in Genesis 37:35, then all his sons and daughters arose to comfort him. And how many daughters were there, right? We only hear of Dinah, also in Vayishlach, she figures very prominently. So how can you say daughters if he only had one daughter, right? That's not the way the plural word works. So the explanation is all those daughters were simply their twin sisters. And a given brother's mother bore twins at his birth, and he would marry her. So that way we can understand that there were these additional daughters because each one was born. We didn't have to talk about them because they weren't important to the narrative per se. And that is where they not only get the daughters for our plural, but also explain who the brothers were marrying now that they are back in the land of Canaan. And maybe there are not any more good relatives of Abraham floating around to become their brides. Moreover, it says so about Benjamin, because this also is a son for you, right? That also is standing out, because this is a son for you is not stated, meaning the verse could have been read perfectly fine without the word also in it, the gam, but because this also is a son for you is how it's worded. Why? Since his mother had given birth to a twin sister, meaning that the twin was already having been born, the two, she had to say, and there was also a boy above the normal two that you would expect, because we've had two births for all of these women along. Another one is also coming, is a boy. So there is something exceptional here, and it's triplets. And that's why the word also shows up in our verse, even though it seems moderately superfluous. Thus, in Genesis 37:35, then all his sons and daughters arose. Hence, you learn that they married their sisters. So this is Yehuda's opinion on where these daughters came from. It should not surprise you. Not everybody agrees with this interpretation. And indeed, Rabbi Nehemiah has a perhaps simpler explanation. His daughters from chapter 37, verse 35, were his daughters-in-law, right? Those were the wives of the boys, and not their twin sisters that they married. Since one's son-in-law is like his son, and one's daughter-in-law like a daughter, one does not refrain from calling his daughter-in-law his daughter. So, yes, he had daughters. Of course he had daughters, because his sons married them, married women, and those daughter-in-laws became his daughters. Jacob welcomed them into his household as though they were his full daughters, as though he had borne them himself or sired them himself. And it's just an idiomatic expression. You don't have to constantly refer to a daughter-in-law as a daughter-in-law. You can also call it a daughter, and that's okay. Now, I have met many families, and I have discovered that there is a wide range of opinions in the modern world on whether or not one calls a daughter or son or brother-in-law or sister-in-law as brother, son, daughter, or sister. Some families are adamant that everybody be called son, daughter, brother, sister, regardless of whether it's in-law or not in-law. The same also can be very important in families where there are blended families from multiple sources, with issues of calling somebody a half-brother or a step-brother. Nope, brother is a brother is a brother. And I have met other families that are equally adamant that it be clear when writing a eulogy or obituary that these people are related by marriage. And that doesn't even mean that there was a bad relationship. They can still say, and he loved his sons and daughters-in-law with all his heart. But it is important for them to still make sure we hear the distinction between those that were born directly and those that joined the family through marriage. And I'll tell you, both are right. The most important thing is how well you treat the people in the family. If you use the phrase in-law or step or half as being some form of stigma or insult, then that's very problematic. But if you are using it just because you find it more accurate or clearer, so that when you tell somebody about your daughter-in-law, they know it's your daughter-in-law, and when you tell someone about your daughter, they know who that is, that's perfectly fine. And likewise, if your family is comfortable calling everybody, regardless of how they join the family, son, daughter, brother, sister, then that's perfectly fine. As long as you are showing them the proper love and respect.
Can I cite something from Tanakh?
Please.
Ruth, Naomi calls Ruth my daughter. In chapter 2, also Boaz calls Ruth my daughter. So it's that broader sense of sons and daughters. We see a more expansive idea of who daughters might be from other examples in Tanakh.
Absolutely. And in fact, this is something as a broader idiom, when we talk about people collectively, B'nai Yisrael, the children of Israel, everyone should be obviously aware that when I say that I am part of B'nai Yisrael, the children of Israel, I am not literally claiming that Jacob was my actual biological father. There's a few thousand years in between us that would make that impossible. But I am claiming that I am part of the group of Israel. And indeed, the phrase ben in particular, but bat as well in other circumstances, is clearly used throughout Tanakh to mean non-biological people, but people that are part of an association or group. This comes up as well with the phrase for people that are b'nai nevi'im, the children of prophets, where we're not necessarily talking about the biological offspring of a prophetic tradition or prophet, but instead about people that associate with prophetic traditions. So the word ben and bat definitely within biblical Hebrew do not always refer only to biology. And that seems to be Rabbi Nehemiah's opinion here to avoid the brother-sister conundrum that other midrashim were suggesting. But we're still left with this question of Rachel, of why is she still treated differently? Why does she still have this special burial place? And what are we meant to take from all of this? And to understand that, we have to take a little bit of a detour through the book of Jeremiah. And this detour, and I mean that word literally, as you're going to see, is very important. Thus says Adonai, a voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are not. Thus says Adonai, refrain your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for your work shall be rewarded, says Adonai. They shall come back from the land of the enemy. and there is hope for your future, says Adonai, and your children shall return to their own borders. All right, so this very moving section of Yirmiyahu is being spoken to those that are going to be carried into captivity by Babylon, carried away to the Babylonian Empire. And the metaphor is that there is a voice, a crying, a weeping coming from Rachel. Now, why from Rachel in particular? Because she was associated with that direction, with the eastern path that would be taken by the captives. But you will notice that she is being called the mother of all of Israel. But she isn't. In particular, at this particular time, meaning with Jeremiah, most of the people who were going were probably from the tribe of Judah or from some of the other tribes of Leah. So almost certainly the bulk of the captives were not even descended from her tribes. So why would she be called the mother of all of them? We'll come to that in a broader sense in just a second, but recognize again that just as we talked about the daughters being daughters-in-law, here too we are saying her children in a broader non-biological sense. But we are seeing her as being the mother of all of Israel and of caring and crying for all of the children of Israel, meaning all of the people that were being subjected to the suffering of Babylon at this time. Now, with that verse in mind, we can understand the following midrash. And Rachel died and was buried. Oh, yes? Yes, go ahead.
Hello? Did I lose you?
No, go ahead. I'm waiting. Meaning all of the people that were...
Okay. This quote that a voice is heard in Rachel crying was put on the Roman coin when they conquered in 70. I didn't know if everyone knows that. So it holds really distinct emotional ties to the Jewish people.
Exactly. This, as we're going to see from the Midrash, this quote from Jeremiah, this concept of Rachel weeping for her children, became an emotional touchstone for our people. So if we look at the Midrash in the middle of the page, it says, what did Yaakov see that he buried Rachel on the way to Ephrat? Why did he bury her there? Right. After all, we would have expected him to bury her in Hebron, but he had a prophetic vision that the exiles would in the future pass through there. Therefore, he buried her there so she would ask for mercy for them. As it is written, a voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children. Thus says Adonai, refrain your voice from weeping. There is hope for your future, and so on from our passage in Jeremiah. So the rabbis understood that the decision to leave Rachel buried there, where she passed away, wasn't just because he was too lazy to take her to Hebron. It wasn't because he didn't care enough to take her to Hebron. It's because he knew that eventually the exiles would pass her grave. And as they passed her grave, her spirit, so to speak, would be pleading with God on their behalf, that there would be this additional emotional outpouring of a request for mercy and compassion to understand that the exile would be only temporary, that it was not a permanent exile, that indeed we would return. And the image of Rachel became the symbol of that notion of the temporary nature of the exile, of the idea that God would listen to her to bring us back, which of course means we now have to answer the big question: why her? Why not have Jacob along the road? And then he could weep on behalf of all of his children to whom he was all biologically connected. Why not have Leah, who was more connected biologically to the children that would be leaving at this particular time that Jeremiah is talking? Why not have Abraham, Sarah? Why not have Hebron on that part of the road so that all the parents, grandparents, great grandparents could join together in pleading for mercy? What is it about Rachel uniquely that would make her the advocate, the lawyer, if you will, the defendant, the defending lawyer, that would make her so much more persuasive than the other patriarchs and matriarchs of that generation? And we get another midrash to try and unpack that. And I don't think I'm going to be able to get it all on one page, or one screen. So let's go ahead and start it off. At that moment, meaning with the exile beginning, the matriarch Rachel leaped before God and said, "Master of the universe, it is known before you that Yaakov," meaning her husband, "your servant, loved me very greatly and worked for my father for 7 years in order to marry me. And when those 7 years were complete and the time came for my wedding to my husband, my father decided to replace me with my sister for my husband." The story we all know. "This was exceedingly hard for me, for it was known to me." Most of the commentators believe that Rachel had to have known what was happening. After all, how could they have kept her from her own wedding if she wasn't going along with it? And this is also in the Midrash. "I told my husband of it and gave him a sign by which he would be able to distinguish me from my sister, so that my father would not be able to exchange me." So she decided to thwart Lavan's plan and set up a system to allow Jacob to act with confidence, knowing that he really was getting Rachel. Thereafter, however, I regretted it, meaning regretted making a plan with Jacob, and stifled my desire to be married to him. And I had mercy on my sister, that she would not be shamed. She became concerned that if she did this, then Jacob would know that it was Leah under the veil. He would rip off the veil publicly, and her sister would be humiliated in front of everybody. And yes, that would be the best solution for Jacob and Rachel, that he not marry Leah by mistake, but it would be the worst result for Leah, as she would now have this public humiliation. In the evening, they exchanged my sister for me, and I gave my sister all the signs that I had given to my husband in order that he would believe that she was Rachel. So she gave her, Leah, the code words. Not only that, I climbed under the bed upon which he lay with my sister. He spoke with her, and she remained silent. I answered him each and every time so that he would not recognize my sister by her voice. All right, so she is saying, I went along with this to the point of I literally lay underneath the wedding bed and was there to convince the man I wanted to marry that it was me that he was being intimate with, in order to protect to protect my sister from the humiliation that would come were she to be exposed. I was willing to do that. Now, I performed kindness for her and was not jealous of her, and I did not allow her to be shamed. And if I, a mere mortal, dust and ashes, was not jealous of my rival and did not allow her to be shamed and humiliated, what of you, living, eternal, merciful King? Why are you jealous of idolatry, which has no substance to it? You have exiled my children, and they have been killed by the sword, and their enemies have done with them as they please. So let's make sure we understand the basis of her argument. She is saying, look, God, I know what it's like to be humiliated. I know what it's like to have somebody taken from you, to be jealous of another person, and to be so bitter and angry over the situation. But I kept my mouth shut. I protected my sister. I showed her kindness. I refused to let her be shamed. I put my own jealousy aside for the good of my family. Now, if I can do that, being just a human being, then God, why are you not going to put aside your jealousy of their idolatry? Yes, my children, the people of Israel, have been engaged in idolatry. And yes, I understand how much that stings. I, among all of the wives, know how that stings, because I had to put myself aside in order to overcome that sting. Whereas all the other wives that were jealous usually got what they wanted. But you, God, you should be able to do the same. And God, immediately God's mercy was aroused, And he said, "For you, Rachel, I shall return Israel to their place." That it was indeed her situation, her life, her willingness, her choices that set the template of laying aside jealousy for something that was more important and better for all. And it was because of her selflessness that God was willing to also set aside his jealousy of the idolatry and to allow us to eventually return to the land of Israel. Now, that is an amazing teaching, and I'm going to come back to how that applies in our more modern life, but it's also a perhaps controversial teaching. So I want to give room for any questions or comments from people that are participating.
What leaps out to me is I perform kindness. So we see that she's a model of chesed. And that becomes as above, so below. So there is this interaction between us and the heavenly court, so to speak, that with her as the model of kindness, it also gives a unique perspective. Since I've been doing we've been reading Ruth lately, my new JPS commentary, which talks about Bethlehem and the story of Ruth and how it's a story of chesed that's unique to that place. And that place is associated with Rachel. So we see, so that chesed becomes why her greatness is so important.
Exactly. The virtue of chesed is powerfully demonstrated by her behaviors through this reading of the story. And I think it really deepens our understanding of the character of Rachel, who often is portrayed as, just being a pretty face and maybe even being a bit, not the ideal wife once Jacob actually has her. But when we look at what it must have taken for her to go along with the situation, to allow her sister to be married, and what she eventually learns in her relationship with her sister and their relationship with their husband, we see that she actually was an incredibly kind and considerate person, that she was willing to put her own feelings to one side for the good of her family, for her sister. And that because of that, we actually ended up with Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, all of the tribes and the entire nation. And that all hinged on her act of kindness, her willingness to overlook her own feelings of jealousy and anger at that very beginning moment with Jacob and Leah. And that's something that I think each of us hopefully will never be in an equal position, but each of us can still learn from. That there are often moments where we feel intense bitterness, jealousy, or anger about someone in our family or someone else. And the question becomes, do we respond with chesed? Do we respond with self-restraint and discipline? Or do we explode? Do we fly off the handle? Do we seek revenge and punishment regardless of the needless embarrassment or shame we might cause to someone else, even someone else that we love? And our pattern should be the pattern of Rachel, of recognizing that chesed should be our first response rather than anger and jealousy. And it doesn't mean that we don't feel that anger and jealousy, but we are able to overcome it. And by overcoming it, we are setting an example and a model, and one that God wants us to follow, and one that we are very fortunate that God follows as well. For if God treated us the way we treat each other sometimes, we'd all be in a very bad position.
Also, I'd like to add that very few women in the Torah are mentioned with such love and affection. I mean, there is a deep sense of love that is projected towards Rachel. And Joseph and Benjamin are truly what? Benjamin is the first king of Israel. Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin, right?
Right.
But there are few women that are described so lovely by their husband. And I think love and kindness are two of the big things that put Rachel apart, and why her crying for us is so heartfelt over the centuries.
Absolutely. And with that, I'll just try to give a little bit more of a summary and finish, because there's one last question that I wanted to work on, and that is the naming of the child that is born. So she named him Ben Oni. And I believe she was going for the idea that this is the child of my suffering, that she saw this child as being what was killing her, and in her pain, in her delirium, I can understand why she gave that name. But Jacob, like I said, for once steps in to give the name for the child that will be the permanent name, which is Benjamin, the child of my right hand. And the right hand, I believe, is Rachel, that it is Rachel, that he is calling his son the son of my right hand, my wife, my Rachel, and that will be the permanent way he looks at this child. And we can then understand later on in the Joseph saga why the protection of Benjamin is so dear to Jacob, because he sees in her, he sees in him everything that he held dear in Rachel, and that Benjamin really does become his right hand, like the mother, like Rachel was before. So he is preserving a positive side of that memory, rather than being reminded of the pain of loss. He is being reminded very positively of what Rachel has always meant. And that's something that Judaism, as in general, tries to follow as a pattern. We don't forget the loss, but we try to remember it in the most positive or constructive way, in order that memory, that person, that spirit is continued to be bound up in the bond of life. With that, we will finish for today. And I'll remind everyone, we've got Mishnah again tonight. And we've got Pathway to Judaism tomorrow. And at the moment, unless something really weird happens in my schedule, we are planning to have classes next Wednesday. So just to give you a little heads up, even though it's the Thanksgiving weekend, I'm not going anywhere. So as far as my schedule currently looks, we'll be able to have our class next Wednesday. If something weird happens, I'll let you all know.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Take care, everyone, and keep studying.